made some of these works, which are wooden panels, and I've built up layers of jelly, thermofax and monoprint, plus a bit of collage. I then used some of my flower photographs, which I played around with in Photoshop and then printed onto tissue paper. This is actually quite an easy process because you just have to tape your tissue paper to copy paper and feed it through your printer. I then glued these onto the panels and the tissue paper helped it just merge into the background. I then wondered if I could recreate a similar technique but using fabrics, and I'm pleased to say that it worked really well, and I made 3 quite large panels. In this video I'm going to show you, I kind of swapped between each of them because I didn't really video it in a linear way. I began by taking some bamboo silk fabric that I had already dyed a while back using the low water immersion technique. I have a video about that if you're interested, and it gives you this lovely sort of watercolour effect and with quite sort of random areas of colour. And I thought that would make a good background to work with. The next stage was to start building up the layers. I did this kind of randomly. I sort of had it in my head which prints that I was going to use, but I didn't plan it out too much. That just tends to be the way I work. It might be better if I had a proper plan, but I just quite like being spontaneous. So I used a mixture of geometric shapes, particularly circles, plus some old favourite thermofax screens, such as this script one that I use regularly and have done since I first had it. And this one that I made from a photo of a close-up of the scales on a butterfly's wing. And I love this pattern. I used either fabric silkscreen paint or acrylic paint that I mixed with textile medium. This gives it a nicer handle on the fabric, so because I knew I'd be stitching into it, this was quite important. Otherwise, you can just use acrylic straight from the tube. Again, with the colours, I kind of chose as I went along. It didn't always work, and then I'd have to modify it with some other colours. I'll show you that a bit later. I've cut some circles out with this die cutter they have, that it comes in concentric circles, so you get lots of different sizes. And I really like to use this, plus I often use the die itself to make a print from. And you can get both a negative and a positive shape from depending on whether you use them as a mask or a stencil. I even used the piece of paper that I cut the circle from. Nothing is wasted. Plus I have several metal and plastic circle stencils, which I again use both with the positive and the negative. I also use quite a lot of packaging, and there's corrugated card here that I've used several times, but it just seems to keep going, and this fun packaging that came with the zigzags on it. I also used some scrapers to remove some of the paint on the plate, again in a sort of geometric pattern, but slightly wonky as well. I wanted it to look hand done. I also wanted to add some more abstract areas of colour. So I did this by rolling on paint or using the jelly plate itself to transfer some. And again, this is kind of serendipitous because you never know exactly what you're going to get. But I think I mostly got away with it. There was one of these backdrops, I did actually decide that I'd just put too much paint on it and it looked a bit too thick and sort of gummed up. So what I did, I reversed it and I found some of the patterns had come through, but you didn't get that heavy look. So I used it like that instead. I would either roller this on, sometimes I painted it on, and I would use it with the jelly plate as well. And I think this improved the look of it. So now I wanted to try and achieve the same effect that I had with the flowers on the tissue paper in my paper version. So I decided to get the same photos that I used printed onto some gauzy fabric. I had some samples made. I use this company called Contrado. I'll mention them below. No sponsorship or anything. I'd love it if they did. And I decided that I liked the feel of the silk organza best of the samples that I'd done. I also got some cotton and some synthetic chiffon as well. But unfortunately, the one I went for was the most expensive, but it just had the best translucency and I loved the feel of it as well. And I thought it would blend well with the background being silk bamboo. I made a bit of a mistake with my order because I got the sizes wrong. They came out a bit too big, and I thought, I just didn't think I had time to make the panels that I had in my head with these sizes. So I decided to suck it up and to reorder them in the sizes I want. And it actually wasn't a waste because one or two of them I didn't really like how they'd come out, so it gave me time to refine the designs a bit more. And I did actually use these as sort of decoration when I had my exhibition on. I hung them, I just stitched them to some muslin or linen and hung them in my summer house, and they actually look really pretty there. The organza was very floaty and quite difficult to handle. Even cutting it could be quite tricky because the fibres would sort of distort very easily, so I had to be very careful. And because of this, I thought that I would actually stick it to the background using spray adhesive, which isn't something I would normally do. I always prefer not to use glue with fabric and to use stitch. And I did think about using Bondaweb, which is a mesh that you can glue to you can iron onto the fabric and then stick it onto the back. But I did some sampling with this and that wasn't very good. So I decided to go down the spray adhesive avenue. To help me with this, because of the fabric having this tendency to distort a bit, I thought I'd mark the area I was going to spray with some masking tape. This would also protect the rest of the fabric because I didn't want to get glue everywhere. This worked pretty well. Some of the areas didn't stick completely on the first pass, so I would pull up areas if I could and respray them. And then I had the idea that maybe some heat would help. So I got my iron on a very low setting and I put baking parchment over the fabric to protect it and gently ironed. And I did find that the heat from the iron was enough to just help the glue stick better, and actually it worked much better than I expected actually. So that was probably something that I'd do again. So I left it was probably a couple of days later. I let it all dry completely before I did any stitching because I didn't want that to affect it. And I wanted to do a bit of light quilting. So I got some cotton fabric, which I used as my backing layer, and a thin piece of felt as my wadding layer. And I layered all these pieces together and I did some quite big stitches to tack with some thread. And the reason you do this is because when you're moving it around under your sewing machine, you don't want the layers to shift too much. So there's several different ways of doing this. I sometimes use a sort of little staple gun type thing, but I thought that might affect the fine fabric. So I thought the easiest and most efficient way in this case was to do it with thread, and that worked. I then did a lot of free motion stitching. I wanted to fill all the space that wasn't where the flower was with really dense stitching, because you get a lovely effect when you quilt, even if your wadding's quite thin. Wherever you stitch goes slightly to the background, and the area where you don't stitch is slightly proud, and you get a slight 3D effect, and I really like this. There was a bit of a risk because I was leaving quite a large area unstitched, and if I hadn't glued the top layer of silk organza on, it could have become a bit sort of baggy and not look very good. But luckily using the spray adhesive got round this. And I have done a video all about a sort of in-depth introduction to how you do the free motion stitching, because it's a bit of a technique that you need to practice. So I'll link that there if you're interested. Here's a close-up of some of the stitching that you can see. And when I'd finished all the stitching, I finished it off. I made some strips in coordinating colours to make a binding, which you first of all machine to the front side and then you fold over and hem by hand. And I could do a short video where I show that in more detail if you're interested, so let me know. So that was it, and here are the 3 finished panels as they hung in the exhibition. And I'm really pleased with how they came out, and I think I'm going to use the techniques for other designs in the future. And I sold one during my exhibition, so I was quite thrilled about that. And I hope you've enjoyed seeing how I make them, and you'll join me again soon in the studio.